Hi, you guys. Welcome to the video for today. Today, I'm going to talk about my recent visit to a plantation in Virginia and some of the takeaways I had. Both the kind of expected takeaways and some experiences that weren't so expected. Yeah, let's just get right into it. Early in the month, I went to visit my brother in Virginia, and we decided to go and visit a couple of plantations in the area. One of the plantations we visited was the Shirley Plantation, which is located in Charles City County, Virginia. Um, a little bit of information about the Shirley. The Shirley Plantation is still an active plantation. It is the oldest family owned business in North America. It was the oldest plantation in Virginia, and they currently operate it as a working plantation. They still grow cash crops. They have a restaurant and winery on site, and of course, you can go and visit the property of the main home. So that is the Shirley Plantation. When I went to the plantation, I didn't really have too many expectations. I mean, I've been researching history for a long time. I consider myself to be an amateur genealogist. I'm very familiar and comfortable with that time frame or that time period in history. So I didn't have any. I wasn't expecting anything weird or untoward or anything like that. It is what it is when you go to visit plantation grounds. You know the history of the land, you know the history of the property. So there's not much to be surprised about if you have been researching that time period for a while. So I didn't have any weird expectations. But I found that when I left, I was a little bit more emotional than I expected. One, yes, because of the history, right, of enslaved people on that property. That will make anybody emotional. But also, I found myself contemplating the fact that this was still an active plantation and they were still making money off of the history there, um, the history of slavery, the history of the South. And the government is subsidizing this to a certain extent because it is a national historical landmark. So, I just wanted to talk about where is the balance between like the preservation of history and profit. And do the owners and or the federal government have a responsibility to make sure that the history that's being represented is represented honestly, um, and it's complete, right? Like it's not erasing any part of history. Because when I went to the Shirley, one thing that stood out to me is that there was very little mention or evidence of the enslaved people who worked that land. And I found that to be problematic because there's no doubt that the Shirley is a historic place. And it should be preserved because it is a part of this nation's history. It's an ugly part of this nation's history, but it is a part of history. So it should be preserved. But shouldn't the story or the narrative for that part of history be complete, right? Like, shouldn't you tell the story as it happened? Because the reality is, the Shirley Plantation would not have evolved into what it is without the labor of enslaved people. And that has been erased from their preservation of that. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a few small mentions of enslaved people on the property, on the Shirley Plantation's website, if you go to that website, for example, there's a marker of a slave who escaped during the Civil War, kind of talking about his life and how he escaped and fought for the Union. And that's great. I'm glad he escaped. I'm glad that he was able to find freedom at the 11th hour, so to speak. But is that enough of a representation? Like, what about the hundreds of years, right, that the Shirley Plantation actually owned slaves? The thousands of slaves that went through that property and were forced into labor to make the Shirley Plantation be the most profitable plantation in Virginia and maybe in the entire South. Without the labor of those people, Black people, enslaved people, there is no history to preserve at the Shirley Plantation. So to see the barely there minimal mention of Black folks on that land was disturbing, especially when I could stand on the property and look around and see that they're still making money off this land. Money that to an extent the government is subsidizing, because once you become a national historic landmark, you receive tax incentives for maintaining your property and for keeping that history, so to speak, alive. There are tax incentives for you to do that. There are federal grants that you become eligible for to continue to develop your property and again, for just basic maintenance and such. So there are financial benefits to preserving that history, but the question is not whether or not the Shirley should be a national landmark. It should be. It is. The question is, before the government awards these financial benefits and awards this designation, shouldn't they have a responsibility to make sure that the narrative that's being told is complete? Because what's really happening is that they are erasing the presence of Black people and their contributions to whatever you want to say the South ended up being. They're completely erasing that. And not only are they erasing it, they are then using this whitewashed history to get benefits in 2023, financial benefits from the government. And the government seems to be okay with that. So when I left that property, I felt a certain type of way about them making profits off of a historical narrative that couldn't exist without the presence and work of the people they enslaved for hundreds of years, because the Shirley Plantation was started in 1614. So we are literally talking about over 200 years of slavery on that land. And you have one marker and a display of farming tools that you say slaves used on that property. That's it. That's all it has. And if you go to their website, they of course say that they're preserving history to represent the indigenous people, the indentured servants, and the enslaved people who contributed to that land. But there's no visual representation of that, or I should say, very little visual representation of that. And of course, you have to include indigenous people because you didn't buy the land anyway, you took it from them. So it just felt, it was disturbing. And I just want to repeat, it's not that these plantations, I'm talking about the Shirley now, but any plantation that's being preserved, it's not that they shouldn't be landmarks. It's not that at all. They should. It's just that the narrative needs to be complete, right? Talk about why this plantation was successful, because it wasn't on the labor of your ancestors. It was on the labor of ancestors of people who look like me. So it's just that was a surprising takeaway for me, because I've seen plantations before, I've visited plantations before, and I've never felt that strongly about this particular topic. I mean, I always feel emotional about the enslaved people who were there, who were present on that property, because you can almost feel their souls that were trapped in that land. You can almost feel that when you go to these plantations, and you cannot leave if you have really any heart or decency. You can't really leave those properties and not have that be an emotional moment for you. So, yes, there is that, but I've never really felt this dismay at seeing a winery operating on the hill and a restaurant operating on that hill, and all these fields of cash crops that are still being grown and still being sold, and this property is still collecting checks um, on the history of slavery, but they're glorifying it to represent a South that really didn't exist, and that's the South without slaves. So, yeah, my ultimate question is still, what responsibility does the government have before making these national historic landmark designations, which qualifies these properties to receive financial benefits? Shouldn't more of an effort be made to accurately represent history and to make sure that the story, the narrative that's being shared, is complete? That's the main takeaway. So, I would say my opinion is that they should have more of a responsibility. My assumption was that they had a responsibility and that they made efforts to do that. And maybe they do to an extent, but it needs to be more than what it currently is. That's my opinion. Um, and that's because slavery is the largest part of what makes these plantations historic. Let's just call a spade a spade. That's what it is. And if you have a narrative that erases slavery from that, but at the same time you are still profiting from that history, then it kind of feels like you're still profiting off of the misfortune of others. You're still profiting off of slavery. And that's my takeaway about my visit to the Shirley Plantation. Leave your comments, leave your thoughts, and yeah, read the complete blog if you are interested. I'll have it linked down below. Thanks for coming.